Welcome to the Integral Stage and to a special episode of the Future Faces of Spirit series. Today, Layman, Pascal, and I are happy to welcome spiritual pioneer Andrew Cohen to the stage for a trialogue on the future of religion and spirituality. Andrew is, of course, very well known in our community as a teacher of integrative evolutionary spirituality, as a longtime dialogue and thought partner with Ken Wilber, and as the founder of EnlightenNext and now Manifest Nirvana. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Nice to be with both. Nice to be with you both.
And Layman, is there anything you'd like to say by way of introduction before we get started?
I think just as framing, I'd like to say that I'm not personally very interested in questions like, hey, why did the community fail? Or aren't you a weird OCD power mad hipster sociopath or things like that? I feel like that's been covered in a lot of areas. I want to say, great to have you here. Really nice to see you. I've been having a great Andrew Cohen week. Had a beautiful conversation with Daniela. Talked to your friend Lonnie Jarrett. Here you are, and I'm rocking the classic Andrew Cohen look. What I'd really like to say to you is, in my personal interactions with your students and ex-students, I have invariably found them to be smart, open, healthy, flowing, interesting, evolving people. And I think that that's significant. That's a kind of high praise, is what I wanted to say.
Well, thank you, Layman. Actually, a lot of people have told me that. Many people said, I've never met a student of Andrew's I didn't like.
Same here.
And I agree with you. It does mean something important. It has to.
We had a wonderful conversation with Carter Phipps about a year ago. And,
yeah, I heard and listened to part of that, and also with Amir, I think.
Yes, great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'd like to get us started. And again, welcome. We're very happy to have you here. And when we think about the future of religion and spirituality, usually a couple options come to mind. Either the future evolution of existing forms of religion, or else the novel emergence of altogether new vehicles or traditions out of our current unique circumstances. And with a name like EnlightenNext, obviously you've been thinking about the future of religion for a long time. So I wanted to just start with a very open and general question first, and that is, what do you see is on the evolutionary horizon? What is your vision of what wants to come next in the areas of religion and spirituality?
Well, to speak about religion and spirituality is probably a bigger topic than I'm capable of really speaking about with any kind of authority. But, the first thing is that EnlightenNext became the name of our magazine and the name of our organization because the name of our magazine used to be called What is Enlightenment? And that was because after I came back from India, I had a very powerful awakening with my guru, H.W.L. Punjaji, who was a very radical Advaitin. And then when I came back and I was always very philosophically inclined, so I never would take anybody's word for anything. I wanted to know what things actually mean. So I started asking a lot of questions, and the Advaitin position, which was the proclamation that everything is an illusion, only consciousness alone is real, just wasn't adding up to me. And so when I came back to the West and the community formed very quickly around me, I started asking a lot of questions, and especially when a lot of these traditional structures that create the context in which enlightenment is expressed enter into a postmodern context, a lot of questions emerge. And I had a lot of questions. So I would sit around and ask these questions out loud, and when I was teaching, I'd ask these questions. And eventually, we had a little newsletter that turned into a magazine, and we were asking a lot of these questions in public. So that was a question because I wanted to. I felt that the experience, the awakening to non-duality, always needed to be contextualized, because people were speaking about it in different ways, and what did that actually mean? So that was the first period of deep inquiry. How do we contextualize this experience? And really, the second very big leap, which took us to EnlightenNext, was our collective discovery of the evolutionary context. And that emerged after about 10 years. And it became a big part of the theme of the discussion, of the ongoing discussion of the people I was working with on the magazine. And when my friendship with Ken began with my sharing with him my discovery of the fact that I didn't think that that emptiness or nothingness or being alone was the ultimate nature of reality. I also felt becoming in the evolutionary process had equal validity and equal significance about the ultimate nature of the absolute, or about the ultimate nature of God. And so then this question, well, is now the whole question of spiritual liberation, or the traditional teaching of enlightenment or liberated consciousness would be emerging in a completely different context, the context of the evolution of the cosmos. And of course, we weren't the first ones to discover this. Of course, it had been Teilhard de Chardin and the great Sri Aurobindo and others. But in terms of the postmodern spiritual marketplace, it seemed to be very unknown and very new to most people. And all the Enlightenment teachers, almost with no exception, at that time, were only speaking about being as the ultimate context in which enlightened awareness emerged. And this was true in my trips when I speak to teachers in India and when I was in the West. So we really felt we were onto something, and so this created really this was the second and new and big revolution in our thinking, and the other piece in terms of my own development that was very important, and then I'll try to answer the question you asked me directly. About a year into my teaching experience, some people who were following me around had invited me to lunch. Group of people, and they were very committed. I remember after lunch, I saw a man and a woman were having a conversation by the sink, and I was just sitting by myself observing them. And I noticed that they were having a conversation and I realized that they were speaking from the very place that they seemed to have awakened to as a result of spending time with me. And I suddenly recognized that there was enormous potential in being able to share this enlightened awareness in an intersubjective context, that if this could become the shared ground in which and upon which human beings meet each other and explore our humanity and explore the human experience, this would be a completely new adventure. If non-duality could, if ultimate non-duality, if awakened non-duality, if the felt sense and experience of awakened non-duality could become the living context in which we share the human experience, this would be nothing less than a spiritual revolution. So I became very interested in this, and for a long time, this idea of what I used to call personal enlightenment or my enlightenment, it just wasn't adding up anymore, because the context in which we were all living seemed to be much bigger than my liberation alone or your liberation alone. So I started working on this project of to put it in kind of crude terms, to liberate enlightened awareness, so it could become the shared ground of the shared intersubjective framework in which human beings could meet each other. And it was very hard. I had a vision about it, many years before it actually emerged, and I had a vision of what was possible, but I had to push my students very, very hard, sometimes too hard, in order to catalyze this breakthrough. But I didn't give up, and eventually it happened. It happened in small bursts. And then there was a big explosion. And when these explosions started happening, I was beyond happy. I was beyond thrilled, because sometimes I wondered if I was crazy, because I kept pushing for something that most people just couldn't see and didn't understand. And I was on my own, and I was pushing pretty hard. But when it happened, I realized that this was the beginning of something completely new. And secondarily, when these breakthroughs happened, there was another context of this discovery, which was that there was the difference in result when someone would awaken to enlightened awareness in the context of being, which is usually called the true self, commonly, or when someone awakened to enlightened awareness in the context of the evolutionary impulse or the evolutionary trajectory of the cosmos. And then I started to call that expression of the awakening to enlightened awareness the authentic self. And what I became aware of, what we all started to notice, is that these are two completely different states of enlightenment. And the state of enlightenment of the true self, one becomes conscious of what definitely seems like eternity. And I'm saying seems like because I heard your conversation with David Long the other day, so I want to be tentative about it. I personally don't have any metaphysical doubts about it. I feel quite doubtless, but I can't prove to anybody that's true. But my own experience tells me that this is so, and the experience of so many other realizers confirms that it's so. But the awakening to the true self, we awaken to a metaphysical living context that certainly feels very much like eternity, timeless and formless and beginningless and endless, and definitely an ultimate domain of reality that seems to exist prior to time, prior to the arising of time, and prior to the arising of the whole creative process. And in that state of consciousness, one experiences freedom from the body, from the mind, from samsara, from the human experience, and from the evolutionary processes. All one experiences freedom from, and that's the traditional. It's the traditional, in the Eastern sense, the traditional experience of liberation is freedom from the body, the mind, and the world, and the whole universe. And it's ecstatic, and it's delightful, and it's ever new. It's ever new. And I believe this is the very foundation and ground of enlightenment. But in this evolutionary enlightenment, and the awakening to what I call the authentic self, I noticed that one awakened to a different context of liberation. This was, and in this, it's what it always seems like, feels like, is experienced like. And one awakens to an infinite context, but it's the infinite context in which it feels like one is awakening to or becoming aware of the energy and intelligence that created the universe and is creating the universe. It's the evolutionary impulse. This energy and intelligence seems always to be reaching towards the future. Seems always to be reaching towards the future, groping towards the future, and aspiring towards the future. The true self is always dwelling on what is. That's why a lot of enlightenment teachers tell us to be with what is, dwelling on the present moment. The authentic self is always interested in what could be. Never what is, but always what could be. I always tell people, if you were God and you created the universe, would you be more interested in what you have already created, or would you be interested in what you have not created yet? And everybody says, I'd always be interested in what I have not created yet. And so my experience of what I'm calling the authentic self, or awakening to this evolutionary, the telos of evolution, is there is this spontaneous, ecstatically compelled fascination and interest in what's possible. And not only an interest in what's possible, but a egoless excitement and sense. It's the sense in that state. The sense is that all things are possible. It's a state that's utterly free from doubt, utterly free from cynicism, and utterly free from any kind of negativity that comes from the ego mind. And when people are awake to this authentic self, there's an awakened innocence, not naivete, but innocence in the sense that one feels that all things are possible in the most life-positive way possible. And so then when we discovered this authentic self, this awakening to the authentic self became the goal of the teaching, even though awakening to the true self was always foundational and continues to be foundational. Because if we can awaken to our true selves and are able to somewhat stabilize in the awakening to the authentic self, the creative potential that emerges within the individual, within the awakened individual, and potentially between awakened individuals who at least within the context of this state of consciousness, or at least temporarily liberated from all the obstacles of doubt and fear and competition and self-loathing and trauma and all the rest of it. The creative potential seemed unlimited, extraordinary, profound, and enormously important for the evolution of our species. If this capacity could be cultivated amongst a significant group of intelligent realizers. So this became our project. Our project, and it was very rocky because what happened was it was very once these breakthroughs started happening, it was almost like we'd struck gold. Miraculously, this thing would explode time and time again. But the problem was that individuals had trouble stabilizing, and so there was this going back and forth between these profound explosions of evolutionary potential, this awakened to enlightened awareness in the context of evolution. And then of course, the limitations of where each unique individual is actually at in their own development. And so we were working a lot with that discrepancy, but that became our project, and it's still my project. It's very much still my project and what I'm living for with all of my heart. And the idea behind, I'm sure Daniela must have explained this to you, but the idea behind the concept of manifest nirvana is that in the traditional being enlightenment, nirvana is a state of consciousness or a state of nirvikalpa samadhi, I think. It's a trance state where one is awakened to eternity, or the state of consciousness that the Buddha referred to, the unborn and the uncreated. It's the freedom from. So the original experience of nirvana, as far as I understand it, is becoming stabilized in freedom from manifest reality. And then, of course, with what I understand to be the second turning of the world, the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma in Buddhism, there was a recognition, the Buddha's recognition that form is emptiness and emptiness is form, and that the ultimate nature of reality is the very emptiness. The ultimate nature of all reality, including all manifest reality, is not separate from what discovers in these deepest meditative states. And so therefore everything we're looking for is right here. We don't have to escape from embodied existence. We just need to wake up and have the courage to fully embrace it, realizing what it ultimately is, and find our liberation here and now, fully immersed in the human experience. And as my guru often would repeat to me, he said, samsara and nirvana are one and not two. And he said, Andrew, when you really understand this, that samsara and nirvana are one and not two, you'll be free. And this as far as my understanding goes, this is the most, at this time, at least in the postmodern spiritual marketplace, is the most common expression of the understanding of enlightenment, is that samsara and nirvana are one, and learning how to see and understand and fully accept all the complexities and challenges of the human experience in the context of our ultimate nature is a big part of what the practice of enlightenment is at this time. So in the experiences that we were having and that I've described to you, which were always temporary, they never lasted forever. They were never. There was for some people they last for weeks. But generally, they were short-lived. But nevertheless, there were these temporary immersions in this profound state of consciousness in which all the individuals would temporarily awaken to their authentic self. And in that state of consciousness, temporarily, everybody's small self vanished, and everybody was at their best, and usually was expressing a level of creative potential, a higher intelligence and awakened complexity that was way beyond their usual capacity. And so it's what's possible in that state, where at least temporarily everybody's small self has been left behind, that I call manifest, because it's the manifestation of nirvana. But it's a world embracing, universe embracing, evolution embracing nirvana, in which only the best part of ourself is temporarily awakened to. And so what becomes possible then, giving rise to that potential, what becomes possible then, is what I'm very focused on, giving rise to or catalyzing. That's why it's called manifest nirvana. But it's difficult, because it's difficult for any of us to stabilize, to become perfectly stabilized in these higher states. And I think that at least in the context of awakening to enlightened awareness, these higher states are essential and fundamental and prerequisites to I believe, giving rise to our creative potential individually and collectively. This is what I personally believe. I don't I know not everybody thinks so. And I also know that when these states are experienced in all their fullness and glory, people at least temporarily realize the potential they never thought was possible. They just completely are overtaken by the blessedness of their own potential and with the blessedness of the highest and deepest dimension of reality, and they really wake up. Now the problem is, and this is very painful, we can awaken in such a profound way and know we've done it. You know, one thing is awakening, but knowing that you've actually awakened, bearing witness to the fact, and taking responsibility for in the context of bearing witness, and still forget the glory and the perfection of what one had realized. So it's oh so delicate, and I know why now. The Buddha said, you know, he said, why should I teach? And I don't remember if it was his thought or what someone said to him, for those with little dust over their eyes. So these awakenings always are very profound and explosive, but unless I imagine, I think this has to do with our development in the context of karma and the long-term sense of the evolution of our karmic potentials. I think unless karmically we were predisposed to being able to hold its realization, most people can't hold it and actually fall into a state of forgetfulness. Even though they know that they knew something amazing, unless you're in touch with how amazing it really is, you forget how all important it truly is. And only when we know how all important it truly is will we focus on it and allow it to become the center or the major organizing principle in our relationship to life.
These the dynamics of assimilation is something I'd like to get into, how we turn our realizations into who we are. First, I'd like to say I appreciated your use of seems and feels like. One of the things Bruce and I have been working on with so-called post-metaphysical spirituality is how do we tease apart the experience and the living reality from the concepts that we maybe even spontaneously use to describe them. And
Exactly.
I think we should be aware that when we use those little modifier words, we open ourselves to a lot of other people and a lot of other kinds of discourse, and there's no necessary reason why seems to has to be taken to be any less powerful than is. And in some sense, we could say, you know, I've run into a lot of people who express very high experiences and visions, but they often use very primitive languaging, and it creates an odd dissonance in listeners. So I'm very pleased by your willingness to adapt to linguistic nuance. I think that's very important in teachers and transmitters and in the whole community going forward.
Well, I thank you. I realize I've got to be careful. And one of the many great gifts of integral consciousness and integral philosophy is that it's provided a very complex rational framework for interpretive framework for all of us to interpret even the most subtle and delicate forms of human experience. And yet, this is just part of what I feel, and yet, from my perspective, too many people who become good integral thinkers tend to become overly biased towards the rational interpretive framework in such a way that I think obscures their own capacity to intuitively become conscious or cognizant of the deeper potentials in themselves, because the rational framework has become the law. And I think we have to learn how to balance the development of our rational faculties, which is in the spiritual world are beyond essential. A lot of people in the spiritual world just go because they don't feel they have to obey the rules of rational thinking, you know, say things that are quite crazy. So of course that's very essential. And at the same time, we have to be careful not to obscure these deeper and more delicate capacities of knowing that transcend rational thinking. Because the states of liberated awareness that I've experienced and that I continue to experience are deeper than my rational mind can go. And so I can't prove that to anybody, but do I know I have no doubt that it's true because these states continue to save me from my own mind over and over again. And it's like 35 years later, and these states are continuing every day to save me from my own mind. So I know every day that it's true.
Yeah, balance is essential, and when it's right, it's exquisite, because there's something a little sad about having amazing experiences and saying it in a way that's misleading. There's something equally sad about thinking that terminology and rationality, allowing that stuff to overstep its limits and decrease your attentiveness to your state experiences and your intuitive lived confidences. So getting that
Exactly.
just right, I think, is really important for us.
It's difficult. And I think, like Ken himself has said, he said that people think once they begin to grasp, at least at a superficial level, a beginning level integral cognition, once they begin to gain some integral cognition, they begin to awaken to perspectives they never dreamed of. And he said, but then they think they're enlightened. And there's not necessarily any relationship between integral cognition and the awakening to enlightened awareness, at least not yet.
There are a couple different directions that we can go. There's so much I think that we'd love to talk to you about. Before we move too far on from your opening discussion of intersubjective non-duality and intersubjective enlightenment, I wanted to dive into that a little bit more deeply with you also. There's a teacher I'm familiar with that I teach at university, and so we sometimes cover her work in my classes. It's a Judith Blackstone, and she also talks about the intersubjective experience of non-duality and the importance of that. It's interesting in our traditional literature. There's a lot of phenomenological descriptions of the awakened state, but most of the time those descriptions are from the point of view of the individual and not really describing what's happening between two awakened beings. Maybe you find a little example of that in Kashmiri Shaivism or some briefer passages and references, but there's not a lot of dwelling on that. And so I think it's really important territory. I really think both Layman and I have been very, very interested in the intersubjective and in mutuality, in unfolding, awakening in that kind of living context. One of the things that Judith Blackstone points out and that I've resonated with from my own experience in meditation or practicing time-space knowledge practices, she talks about when two people are in that state together, there's an experience of a pervasive space that runs through the individual and through other beings simultaneously, and you experience that 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 awareness ground, that space in your body, in their body simultaneously. And for her, that's been very helpful as a therapist, because normally in doing therapy work and working with one-on-one with individuals to help them, the therapist checks in with transference and countertransference, but you're always not sure what's arising as your own material and what's their material. And she has felt that in a non-dual state with other people, it becomes much more clear what's arising here and what's arising there, because you can feel both at the same time in that kind of liberated, more spacious awareness. It's a mutual participation between beings, and it's easier to parse what's happening simultaneously. And so I wondered, in your in work in this area, have you or your students experienced anything like that? From my perspective, it's not given that we're going to. I think, as Wilbur kind of reminds us, our practices will enact certain spiritual experiences in different ways according to our modes of practice. So I'm not assuming that there must be one universal way to experience intersubjective awakening, but I'm just curious if that kind of sense of mutual pervasive space that leads to greater clarity and self-other perception at the same time as an experience of unity, if that's, something that you and your students have been experiencing.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yes. So first of all, as you were just saying, there's all different kinds of intersubjective union, communion, merging experiences we can have. So the context in which we're coming together will have a big effect on what the result is, or the kind of intersubjective non-duality or oneness emerging that we're going to experience. We can have more personal kinds of meeting each other in an egoless and trusting space, but it's still very personal. It's still you and me meeting in a place of trust and love. But in our work, because of the Enlightenment context, the ground rule is that the ego's got to either disappear or take a back seat. Otherwise, it's not. Otherwise, it could be the experience of profound intimacy, oneness, and love. But it's not awakening to an inherently liberated state, an inherently liberated knowing. So the catalyst. So that's number one. And number two has to do with the fact that, as I said before, that we can either awaken to intersubjective non-duality in the context of timeless, formless being, or we can awaken to intersubjective non-duality in the context of the evolutionary impulse or the awareness of the telos of the cosmos. So if we awaken to intersubjective non-duality in the context of being, it feels like we are floating in a sea of love that exists within us and all around us, expanding to infinity, and including everything, excluding nothing. But what's interesting about intersubjective non-duality in the ways that I've experienced it and that I teach it is that there's a simultaneously shared consciousness and cognizance of the infinite. I am aware of the infinite context, of an awakened infinite context, as you are aware of this infinite context. But simultaneously, I'm still aware of my own unique mind and my own unique history, and you're still aware of your own unique mind and your own unique history. But because of the presence of enlightened awareness, the emotional and psychological burden, neurotic burden of our history is completely gone. So, in other words, Andrew is still fully cognizant of all Andrew's his memory and his gifts are all available to him, as he's simultaneously aware of this infinity of oneness. And Bruce's cognizance and awareness of his own mind and his own history and his own unique gifts would be fully present. But what would be temporarily missing was Bruce's pain and Andrew's pain, Bruce's fear and Andrew's fear, Andrew's narcissism and Bruce's narcissism, and all this kind of thing. Temporarily, it's gone. But in the state of awakened intersubjective non-duality, we don't lose consciousness or awareness of our individuality our sovereignty, as we're simultaneously aware that we're both conscious of this infinite sea. And so what's miraculous about the state is when I'm aware of an infinite non-dual context and you're aware of an infinite non-dual context that is simultaneously you and me, absolutely who I am, absolutely who you are, and yet you're there and I'm here. It's hilarious, and it's liberating, and it's delightful, and it's so freeing. It enables us to meet in a place of incredible dignity and love, in which nothing needs to be accomplished because it's already always happened. But in the being context, there's nothing to be done. It's delightful, but there's nowhere to go and there's nothing to do because that's the nature of being. But in the awakened state of the authentic self, then in the state of delightful freedom, it's like waking up on a moving train. The moving train is moving towards the future, and then we're both awakened by this awareness that these extraordinary future potentials, tears omega point. We both can see it. We both can feel it. We both can see it in the future, and it's calling us to itself, and it's calling, and we realize, well, if we're going to get there, I have to give everything to this project, which is I like to call it the universe project, and you would have to give everything to. We realize I have to give everything to this, so we're going to get there. There's this awakened sense and recognition that the energy and intelligence that's created the universe is calling for everything from me at a soul level. It's calling for everything from you, but it feels like that's everything I was ever born for, and everything you were ever born for. So it's ultimately fulfilling, even if it's on a personal level, quite overwhelming. There's this overwhelming sense of, yes, this is all I want to do, because this makes ultimate and absolute sense out of my embodied existence, my human experience. And so the difference is that that in that state of evolutionarily awakened intersubjective non-duality, we realize there's so much that we can do together. And that's very different than awakening to the same kind of intersubjective non-duality in the state of being. There's so much that we can do together, and because you're still aware of your own mind, you still have access to your own creative potential as it relates to your mind, and so do I. We suddenly, the sense of awakened potential, it becomes, quantifies. It just becomes magnified, and it feels, the feeling is all things are possible. We could do anything together, but the anything is always in the direction of where that omega point is calling us to, which is always greater complexity and utopia. But I just want to emphasize that there's a lot of forms or kinds of intersubjective non-duality or emerging experiences that are very much inclusive of the small self, and are not about including the small self. What I'm describing is clearly not about including the small self. It's about transcending it, if only temporarily, absolutely and completely. So the agenda of the small self, and even if there's still work to be done there, which there almost always is temporarily transcended. That agenda is temporarily transcended. We're seeing beyond it, and it may well be that once we return from these heights of seeing and knowing, we have to continue to work on our small self in order to facilitate to liberate our capacity to actually respond to what we've just seen. But in that state of consciousness, the agenda of the small self and all of its unresolved issues are temporarily nowhere to be seen. And so if we can for some sustained periods of time stay in that lofty context, I mean, what becomes possible it feels like it's without limit. And one of the things that I find is so problematic for so many of us is that we're all capable of so much, but because there's so much unresolved personal stuff, we can't fully give our gifts, because we're just so traumatized or broken at psychological levels. And so for me, I have found again and again that the awakening to enlightened awareness is the ultimate healer. It doesn't necessarily resolve all of our emotional and psychological conflicts, but it especially if we can have sustained periods of time when we can remain in that awakened state, it can heal us and give us a sense of spiritual self-confidence that I don't think anything else can. But what I'm most interested in is what I'm capable of at my best, and what you're capable of at your very best. And therefore, then what we're capable of doing together at our very best is what I'm most interested in. And what I see is the point of everything I'm describing. This state of consciousness that I'm describing is not an end in itself, even though it feels like an end in itself when we experience it. To me, it's a means to a higher end, which is liberating human creative potential at higher and higher levels. Because Lord knows we need to do that.
So you're making a couple of really interesting distinctions. One is between a normal spectrum of mutuality or intersubjectivity, which even has some very amazing options in it, and this other special intersubjectivity of shared liberating knowing, which comes in two modes, a being mode and a becoming mode. So that's a really neat picture, I think, for people to hear and have in their minds. What I'm really curious about is you must have made some close-up observations of several different ways in which this occurs, because you've seen kind of peer-to-peer sharing of liberated knowing among students and in the community. You've obviously seen the teacher-student transmission resonance version, and you've also talked to a lot of other spiritual teachers, and sometimes that must have gone into modes something like that. Did you have a sense of the different flavors and dynamics that might be involved in those different versions, or are they all pretty much the same?
No, I think they're different. I mean, what I wanted to do is I wanted my students to be able to have access to this potential without it being dependent upon my transmission. And so the quote unquote technology that we devised together was that, well, first of all, it was in the whole way I've always approached this. To me, one of the most important things, or the foundation of what makes everything possible, is having a very clear intention. In other words, I'm intending to, in other words, I intend to go to the moon. And if I just sit around and wait for it to happen, it's not going to get there. I have to do everything I can to get there. So there needs to be an awakened commitment that's being supported by a fierce, sincere, autonomous determination. And it's difficult. It's difficult for a lot of people to have that kind of determination for something so intangible. Because what consciousness is and what consciousness is quite intangible, hard to find. And then so to become determined that consciousness is going to evolve, I'm just saying for a lot of people who are very interested in their own spiritual development, I've noticed that it remains too intangible for people to get behind in the way they think they'd actually like to. But that's what makes it all possible. And then the instructor, well, yeah, then there has to be, because the determination, because when I started teaching, about 3 months after I left my guru and I came back to see him, when I walked into the room, he said, "Andrew, I'm so glad you found a friend you'll never be able to see." And this continues to blow my mind, it's like 35 years later. So to have a committed relationship with an ultimate and absolute potential that we cannot grasp, or that we cannot hold, or we cannot see, requires a very high degree of development. But let's presuppose that that's there and that determination is there. What I ask people to do is to come together with the awakened intention, that the capacity of the authentic self will come alive within them. And to become more interested in what they don't already know than what they do already know, which means become more interested in listening than in talking. But because if we come together with an authentic, much greater interest in what we don't already know than what we do already know, and we start listening with a focused intensity and earnestness, that's what catalyzes the miracle of this kind of awakening, and it works, and it works. And several of my former students are teaching this stuff now very successfully. At the beginning, it wasn't happening, and then when it happened, it literally felt like we were like punching. Again, it was what it felt like. It felt like we were punching holes into some very deep dimensions of the cosmos. But at least it feels like some of those holes have remained open, and so the vehicle is having an understanding of how different this directionality, or this, it's like an internal momentum. I compare this to what I think Aurobindo called the psychic being. But it's when it's like when we awaken to the psychic being, it's like waking up on a moving train. We suddenly wake up and the train's already moving. So it would be suddenly we would all become conscious of an infinite context, but that infinite context, within that infinite context, there are currents, and these are currents that are leading towards the future. And the experience is one of ecstasy and infinite potential and awe. And so then we would be awakening to these currents of the cosmos together, and then when we learn how to keep the ego out of the driver's seat, what begins to happen when it really works, and it doesn't always really work, it doesn't always really work, but when it really works, people find access to what's called the mind of the Buddha, the mind of the Guru, and the mind where awakened knowing and awakened cognition comes from. Anybody who has this, awakens to this state, temporarily has access to the same source of wisdom as a realized master. And that same source starts speaking through them. And so the ultimate idea here is for that same source to begin to have a conversation with itself. And there's nothing more profound, nothing more thrilling when that begins to happen. Now, I feel that the inherent potentials in this kind of process have barely been explored so far. Because because as you guys probably know, you can get brilliant people together, geniuses. But they can't necessarily communicate in a way that's mutually beneficial or inherently creative. But if we could somehow teach them how to meet each other in this evolutionarily awakened, liberated mind space, what would be possible? That's what I'm actually interested in. And I mean, I don't feel I'm in a position to be able to actualize that, but I feel that everything I've been sharing with you is a means to an end. There's a greater purpose here, and that I feel that's what it is. So to answer your question, Layman, I've never had that kind of experience with another teacher. I mean, I've had amazing experiences of awakened intimacy in the presence of other teachers or with other teachers. I've had very interesting experiences, but not shared this particular state of consciousness particularly. And I feel, in terms of the role I play as a teacher, is to awaken people to these potentials. But for these potentials to become actualized, it's important that people learn how to awaken to these potentials without me being present, because otherwise there always remains focused on me, and that becomes it's a great gift in the process of awakening and higher spiritual development, but it can also become an inhibition and a limitation. But if people can give rise to these potentials and they can train themselves to do it, then we're off to the races. And then what becomes possible is, I don't know what the limitations of what's possible. I haven't taken it farther than what I've already just described to you, but I know there's so much farther to go.
I was interested in the chapter you shared with us from your forthcoming book. You talked about, your engagement with and interest in, some of the work that's being done in the intellectual dark web community or game beat community, especially around more open and generative forms of dialogue, more awakened forms of dialogue, productive forms of dialogue, at least. Yeah, and that's been a long area of interest for me, and I think there's a lot of interesting, important work going on. David Bohm tried to seed something like that, and Ashok Gangadine has developed a deep dialogue. Kramer has insight dialogue. And so I think there's a felt need for a higher form of communication. And in what you've been describing, uh, I've what I got from that was a focus on really helping people get into that state of mutual uh, awakening, mutual participation in that consciousness, and then approaching dialogue from there, as it might spontaneously arise. And I don't know if that's exactly right, but that's the sense I was getting. And I was wondering also if you, in your work, have developed any particular dialogical practices that either are meant to contribute to this kind of awakening experience or to facilitate it once you're there.
Well, no, definitely the answer is yes. That's what I think I've already described to you. But the point is, it's coming together with people who are committed and determined for everybody to become more interested in what they don't already know than what they do already know. To put much more emphasis on listening than speaking. And then the magic happens. But the thing is, Bruce, that this requires some training, because most of us don't know how to open our mouths without speaking from the small self, even if we have a brilliant mind. It requires training over time. I remember it brings back an experience I had when I was still a seeker, and I remember I introduced my mother to some mescaline, and we had an interesting time together. And then as we were beginning to come down, her ego came back. She wasn't aware of it, and I tried to say that we don't want to go there, and that she was very offended and got angry. But the point is this work is. Whereas the first time, sometimes people can have dramatic leaps beyond the small self. But to be brutally honest with you, it requires training and self-awareness and self-understanding to learn how to allow oneself to rise beyond the ego, and then to stay there, and to not be pulled back down into it. Because if you're with a group of people and everybody is keeping their ego at bay, if one person becomes forgetful, it can destroy everybody else's state. Because it seems like, and I don't mean this in a moralistic sense at all, but there's a rarefied state of consciousness where it feels like there's a state of purity, but I don't mean that in a moralistic sense. And so when the ego comes to the surface, this state disappears. So on one hand, the technical part of how to do it is quite simple, ridiculously simple. But it's not. But becoming this self-aware and this sensitive is not simple. It takes time and practice and self-development. The reason I brought those guys up is because I heard Jordan Hall and Daniel Schmackenberger in some of their podcasts speak about collective intelligence, and they were saying that they felt in order to be able to solve some of these wicked problems that we're facing as a species, we would need to. They felt the solution could only be found through awakening to collective intelligence. That can only be found when people travel, journey beyond ego. So I went, wow, they know about this, or they seem to. I don't know to what degree they actually do. I don't really know. But it's because I heard them both speak about it that I got excited about that, and that's why I mentioned it in the book. But just to repeat what I just said, it does, even though the process itself is very simple, it does require training. And
sorry, go on.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The concept of collective intelligence in an integral framework has two components. It has a lower left and a lower right form. So one of those is systematic, which is like the collective intelligence we'd get from having a smart voting process, where we don't necessarily share a conscious state, but our collective output is smarter than anybody's individual output. The other side of it is this shared intersubjective mutual reality. And
yes.
I think you're quite right that a lot of the people who have been sensing, a lot of the communities that have been sensing and trying to feel their way toward a dialogue that opens up something higher between us, haven't really been getting into a space that's been traditionally used as a spiritual space, this real lived dimension of a higher intersubjectivity. And so one of the things you're saying is that there's a certain approach to getting in there, a certain mindset, a certain willingness, and a certain amount of practice. And the more, I'm assuming the more you go into this, the more it stays with you. But I'm very curious about keeping it with you. You mentioned your mother coming down from mescaline. So what's your take on how do we manage the come down so as to keep more continuity with it? And also, when we reflect back on it and feel how important it is, how do we more deeply assimilate the states? Like, we can go to the states a lot, but what else can we do to assimilate them more deeply into our constant being?
Well, the foundation of everything I teach is the clarity of the intention, which means the awakening to enlightened awareness is more important to me than anything else. I'll usually ask people, "How do you want to be free?" Everybody says yes. Did you want to be free more than anything else? People aren't sure. So, and I can only speak from my own experience. This is what changed my life. As I came to a point when I was 22, and I was tired of suffering, and I was tired of being miserable, and I was tired of being crazy, and I really wanted to be free more than anything else. And I became very determined about that, and very one-pointed and very focused. And I realized when I started going to meditation retreats and started entering into the scene, so to speak, that a lot of people were interested. Very few people wanted to go all the way, even though we don't know what that means. There has to be a kind of a blind commitment to jumping off the edge of a cliff, or jumping out of an airplane without a parachute, or going all the way. So I feel that needs to be cultivated also for most people, and that requires time, introspection, a sincere grappling with the meaning and the purpose of life and of one's own life, and getting to a point when one realizes a degree of earnestness that is very profound. I really mean it. I really mean it. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to do it, but nothing else. Nothing else is going to work for me. So one has to, in a sense, come to one's knees in earnestness before, in front of the friend one will never be able to see. So how does one get a person to that point? You know, I mean, that's part of one of my jobs, and I can only try and express that earnestness authentically and transparently myself, where people can see what it looks like, and then that becomes its own form of attraction. Because then someone, I see it. Because when I met my guru, for example, I never had seen such vulnerability and such. Because at that point in my life, I'm 65 now, and I was about 31 when I met him. I'd given up everything for enlightenment. I mean, I didn't have a back door. I didn't have any other plans. I had no plan B. But I met him, and then he was actually taking my enlightenment seriously, and it scared me. Because I'd never met anybody that took my enlightenment seriously, because I said, oh my God, he really means it. Maybe he's crazier than I am. But I at that point, I couldn't even. So again, I mean, what I'm saying is obvious. It's just that as serious as I wasn't prepared for his level of seriousness. But that's what it takes, and I don't think a technique can help us to realize that degree of earnestness. If we realize that degree of earnestness, then spiritual practice of all forms will help us, and will help us. And there's all forms of spirit. There's many different kinds of spiritual practice, and most of them are all good, and they will help us enormously. But if the earnestness isn't there, we're not going to get the same kind of result as if the earnestness is there. So one of my themes is, as I already mentioned, is jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. If you jump out of an airplane without a parachute, you don't intend to come back. And I think that it's that kind of attitude that one has to cultivate within oneself. And either one's going to do that or one won't. Not everybody's up for that kind of intensity and that kind of one-pointed focus. Some people are, and some people when they wake up in that way, they everything changes. So that's what I teach, and I repeat it all the time. Do you want this more than anything else? Because if we want it more than anything else, then it has to come before any and all other karmic obligations and karmic responsibilities that we have in our busy lives. And we all have a lot of karma to deal with, a lot of obligations, and they're all important. But I speak about, the intention the Buddha had when he sat down under the Bodhi tree. He said, I'm not going to get up until I'm enlightened. So I go, wow. How many people feel that way? But that's what it takes. And so my own guru was just so, he radiated such a awakened devotion and liberated awareness. I mean, he was living in another dimension most of the time that I couldn't see. And he was so real. I'd been with many teachers, but I never met anybody who was so real and so obviously on the other side. And his transmission was so profound and so powerful, and his gift was, he gave me the ultimate gift. I mean, I feel eternally in his debt. Because really what I did is I just showed up at his doorstep, and of course I was very serious. I was as serious as one could be. But the rest was his grace, and that remains to be the case. So my answer to your question is all good techniques work, but ultimately depends on I believe how earnest we really are, and that's what makes all the difference. And if we're earnest, we're going to find our way, whether it'll be through a particular method or a particular technique or a particular teacher or a particular path. We will find our way if we're earnest. We have to. We must, and we will. I believe that.
Yeah, that's a really important and for me a poignant point. I know in my life I have felt that I am serious and spent many years and many hours in practice, and yet I can recall instances in India where I met with a teacher and found at that moment I wasn't ready for the next thing they were asking, and that was very humbling. But in some...
That can also be a gift, because then you could see, well, this is where you needed to work. This is where you needed to put your attention.
Definitely. Yeah, and what I'm hearing you touching on in several of your responses are your tenets on the 5 tenets of evolutionary enlightenment, the clarity of intention and the power of volition, both being related to the earnestness, the seriousness with which you approach, this work. And for the 5 tenets, just for people listening who may not know them: clarity of intention, power of volition, face everything and avoid nothing, the process perspective, and cosmic conscience. I had really kind of 2 questions about that, especially in relation to what we can see, for an emergent spirituality for our time. Do you see these tenets as kind of co-arising and mutual, or are they step-like in that you need to, each one is kind of foundational for the next? My sense is, the latter, at least in the beginning. It feels like there's a directionality and a deepening layering of foundation in the order that you've presented them. But in that context, my second question then is your last element of cosmic conscience. I'm interested in your sense of how the previous tenets kind of set the ground or till the ground for that flowering of cosmic conscience.
Should I go through them briefly?
Sure.
So the first one is where most of us start. I want to be free. I want to be enlightened for me. It's a natural place to begin. All about me. And I think that's a good, if we're earnest, it's a good place to start, and it's a good place to get really serious. I want to be free. It's about my liberation. Then And of course, do I want to be free more than anything else? That's the existential challenge of the first tenet, as we were speaking about it. And I think that can take somebody all the way, quite frankly. So the law of volitionality, the second one has to do with this whole issue of choice or volition. And I know there's different arguments about whether we have any agency or not. But that's a different discussion. But I'm convinced that we all have a measure of agency. I think that we're also as evolutionary psychology is helping us all to realize we're all more infinitely more conditioned in multiple levels simultaneously than we've ever understood, and we seem to be finding out more and more about how conditioned we really are. So that means we have there's less agency than probably we think. But that doesn't mean there's none. So I believe we all have a measure of agency. And so unless we can locate that measure of agency and align it with our desire to be liberated, there's no hope for our liberation. So because choice is the choices I make define who I am, define what's important, what's ultimately most important to me. And it'll tell any objective observer where I'm really at and what I really care about. Not what I say, necessarily my best moments, but the actual choices I make in public and in private. So, yeah, so the first 10 is wanting to be free more than anything else. The second has to do with taking responsibility for the God-given gift of a measure of agency, which is that's what we've all been given. That's the ultimate gift for a postmodern person, is to realizing that we have freedom. There's a measure of freedom to make choices, and that means that all things are possible. It's not a lot, but it's enough to make all the difference. And of course, then the third tenet, which is the hardest one, which is the hardest one for all of us. I struggle with it every day. Say, well, if you want to be free more than anything else, you have to face everything and avoid nothing. And facing everything and avoiding nothing is probably actually impossible. But we need to strive to try and do it anyway, knowing we're going to fail. Because the practice of awareness is really the practice of enlightenment in the personal sense of what it means. Really paying attention at deeper and deeper and more and more multiple levels at the same time. How awake someone is, you can tell by how much they're paying attention. You can tell how much anybody's paying attention by how they are, by how they enact their own humanity, especially as you get to know them over time. And also, if someone's going to be evolving, the only way we can evolve is by learning through facing everything and avoiding nothing. And to me, it's the hardest part of the practice of enlightenment. It's an unrelenting challenge. Not, of course, when we're in a state of spontaneous awake awareness, and it's easy to have the experience of feeling like one's seeing everything and knowing everything, even though one really isn't. But it's easy in that state. But we're not necessarily in that state. We have to make an effort to pay more and more attention. So those first three, wanting to be free more than anything else, the law of volitionality, and facing everything and avoiding nothing, those three tenets, I believe, are all one needs for what I call personal enlightenment. And we're going from a personal enlightenment to an evolutionary enlightenment. We're taking a leap beyond this personal aspiration, this personal motivation. And so the fourth tenet of the teaching is when we want to awaken to and begin to pay attention to the radically, with the fact that all human experience is being produced by a cosmic process that had a beginning in time 14 billion years ago. So everything that we're experiencing is, all aspects of our experience, conscious and unconscious, personal and transcendental, are all being produced by a cosmic process. And so can we take the perspective of this cosmic process on our personal experience? Because from that perspective, everything we're experiencing is not personal. It appears to be personal from the ego's perspective. It feels personal from the ego's perspective. But when we look at the human experience from a process perspective, everything that is occurring is impersonal. And can we begin to deconstruct the personal, the illusion of the personal, through peering through this impersonal lens? When I experience fear, when I experience lust, when I experience joy, when I experience happiness, when I experience love, no matter what I experience, including my most exalted spiritual experiences, can I see them all from a very detached place of being absolutely being produced by a cosmic process that's producing everything, and every aspect of my felt human personal experiences are all products of that process. And can I learn to see everything that's happening within me and without and around me, and including everything that's happening in the entire cosmos, all as part of one process. And that, of course, is taking it's a perspective taking, but it takes effort, it takes practice, and something we need to remind ourselves, and I need to remind myself also, repeatedly, to do again and again and again and again. It's always liberating when we can do it, when we have the spiritual courage and spiritual strength to let go of the veil of the personal. It's utterly liberating, and it awakens compassion, because we see we're all going through this, we're all having this experience, and some of this experience is very challenging, it's very difficult, and some of it is glorious. And then finally, cosmic conscience is the name of cosmic conscience used to be in earlier years for the sake of the whole, which is when we realize a certain degree of maturity in our practice. We suddenly realize, wait a minute, I was in this for myself, but now I realize this was never about me, this was never for me. This is for the cosmos, this is for reality itself. I'm a vehicle. I'm not the object of this process. I'm actually, in an evolutionary awakening, I'm a means to a larger end. If I get it deeply enough, if I awaken to it deeply enough, I realize that I'm here for a reason. I'm here to give my gifts. If I can let go of my small self, I'm here to serve the glory of this miraculous intelligence that's revealing itself to me. So I'm here to give, and I'm here to serve. And that's what all people who deeply awaken come to this point where they realize it was never about me, it was never for me. And of course, that's where we start with the first tenet. We start with, I want to be enlightened for myself. And then at a certain point of maturity, it becomes laughable. We laugh at our own small-mindedness. We realize, no, this was never about me. This was always for everyone else. It was for the universe. And so at that point, if that awakening is deep enough, we develop a sense of conscience about our relationship to life, and that falling back into fundamentally an egoic survival selfishness begins to be seen as being unseemly or undignified, unloving, and godless, if I could say such a thing. And then, of course, in my own journey, I've had a very challenging time the last 7-8 years, coming up against my own limitations. And part of that awakening has been, I never understood the Buddha's first noble truth about suffering. Because I'd awakened to evolution. I said, man, life is not about suffering. Life is about the ecstatic urgency of the evolutionary impulse. What's all this a business about suffering? And so it was only when I was faced with the depth of my own suffering, I had an awakening one day to a realm. I can only call it a realm in which the unbearable suffering that all sentient beings are subject to for certain periods of time, or sometimes often for too long. But there's a certain realm or dimension of reality where we become aware of the unbearable suffering that's part and parcel of embodied sentient existence. And at a certain point, my own suffering, as I realized, was not separate from all suffering that is, and how unbearable the truth of suffering is, and how one can never ultimately come to terms with it. One can only open one's heart as much as one has the courage to do, and let it in and feel it. And in my case, this helped me to kind of embrace parts of my humanity that I'd lost touch with, or that I'd never known before. And then it was only then, it was quite late in my life, that I suddenly understood, oh, that's why the Buddha stressed the importance of awakening to the truth of suffering. Because I realized without being awakened to the truth of suffering, even the most exalted states of consciousness can be escapist. It can, as liberating, as exalted as they can be, they still leave one, to some degree, cut off from being fully in touch with life. And I've realized we've got to do it all. But yeah, cosmic conscience is very important, because at that point we're not living this life for ourselves anymore. We're not in this for me. And that's when we embrace what I call the universe project, which is because when we awaken deeply enough, we become aware of the fact that whatever consciousness is, ultimately it's a mystery, but whatever consciousness is, it's trying to awaken more profoundly. Consciousness seems to, in a mysterious way, is always seeking for itself, and it's always seeking to become more. So when we would say, well, what is the omega point? There's a lot of speculative theories about it. So one speculative theory, which makes sense to me, is that when all matter in the universe turns to light, this is all metaphorical. Light's a metaphor for consciousness. Then, from some absolute perspective, this whatever compelled the universe into existence, whatever that urge would have been, at least from a metaphysical perspective, would have been fulfilled. Whether that's actually true or not, I don't know, but it makes sense to me. But even though I know the picture is much more complex than that, and probably there's a lot more to the picture, but it makes sense to me. But there's a calling when we make ourselves available. When we make ourselves available, we feel that we're being called by a mystery that the mind can't see. And so it's submitting ourselves, or giving ourselves over to that mystery that the mind can't see, is ultimately what it becomes all about when we enter into a mature relationship to our development. I believe that. And then we do the best we can in all our human imperfection, all the imperfection of our human vehicles, and we do the best we can.
There's an interesting relationship here between, the impersonal and the personal, because people might hear the transformation of the world into light and consciousness, if they accepted that. Some people might think, well, that's a kind of a sterile view that doesn't embrace the material complexity and richness and idiosyncrasy of my personal thing. And yet somebody else might hear that that's going to be completely included in that the
Absolutely.
things that we value and love best about ourselves are part of the universe's attempt to become more as us. And this was on my mind when I was reading your thoughts on a turquoise or mature integral level 3 jewels project. I think absolutely all 3 of those jewels need to move forward. They can be included at these higher levels. There's a work of seeing where they want to emerge into, and also a work of teasing apart, the Dharma forms, the Guru function forms, and the community forms from the past that we want to take forward with us, and the ones we want to leave behind. But I started thinking maybe there needs to be a 4th gem here, because in a lot of the things you're saying, when you speak about authenticity, the authentic self, sovereignty, that's very individual in a way. It's very personal. And also there's been this progressive realization in your own experience of your limitations. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of what personal needs people in communities might feel they're not getting met, and that might sabotage their own project in those communities. Do we need to really respect that? Is there a need for a 4th gem, some kind of an individual or personal gem?
Well, yes, absolutely. But I think that gem is already there because, as you're probably well aware, because of the limitations and failures of a lot of awakened teachers, there's been a collective realization, wait a minute, this awakening to higher states is not enough. And as Ken's pointed out, shadow motivations and impulses can exist side by side with the awakening to the brightest light of consciousness. And the awakening to the brightest light of consciousness does not illuminate the unconscious. So I think there's a general awareness of the fact that there needs to be a 4th jewel. So my answer would be an unequivocal yes, as long as the 4th jewel doesn't become more important than the awakening to enlightened awareness itself. And my fear is that that's what's happened as of late, as of the last 10 years. A lot of the people who are interested in spiritual development are more focusing on psychotherapy as a path, and it's genuine, and the possibility of a deeper kind of awakening has been, at least to my mind, forgotten by too many people. So my answer to your question is yes, as long as the light of enlightened awareness is still being given priority within a hierarchical matrix of significance. So we need to honor all the painful revelations, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. That enlightenment does not enlighten the unconscious, and then one can be in a powerfully enlightened master and still be a very disturbed individual. But the problem is this has created an ocean of cynicism and doubt about the significance of enlightenment itself, and I feel very troubled that I've contributed to that in my own way. So I feel that the fourth jewel already exists in the psychospiritual marketplace that we're in. Because if you just look at what's out there, everybody's talking about the fourth jewel. They're not talking about enlightenment that much anymore. So I think that jewel already exists. I'm just repeating what I just said. Is I feel that enlightenment needs to be put on the top of the sandcastle again, as hierarchically ultimately having greater value and significance, even if it's not going to make us a perfect person. And I'm trying to include that fourth jewel in the context of awakening to enlightened awareness, in its own context, honoring it. I feel it needs to be honored within its own context. If not, we're going to get into trouble. So many spiritual teachers have done. But we don't want to diminish the glory and the magnificence of enlightened awareness as a result. And so that's kind of how I like to put it.
Sure.
I'm really interested in. Were you going to do a follow-up question, Layman?
No, go ahead, Bruce.
Okay. Yeah, I'm really interested also in what you were writing about in the book chapter you shared with us on the turquoise expressions of the three jewels. And one thing I was thinking about, Wilbur he's taken a turn towards the post-metaphysical framing of things. And Layman and I have both tried to explore that in our own ways and try to wrestle with that and grapple with that. And, I think where both of us sit is that it doesn't mean a rejection of metaphysics. It's maybe a criticism of some past forms of metaphysics and striving for a more adequate metaphysics, one that's in tune with our knowledge now and grounded in our possibilities now, actuating for our possibilities now. And so I wanted to just venture into a metaphysical kind of question in that context, because they can, the metaphysics we hold can shape things deeply for how they unfold for us. So one alternative that's out there in the theological metaphysical world space is a monistic emanationism versus something like a Trinitarian perichoresis. So monistic emanation is there's the one that shines out. Ultimately, there's the one that's the ground, and then there are differentiations that are created, emanated out of that oneness. And then in maybe a Trinitarian perichoresis, there's the many one is always there, that there are the multiple that always enfold all of the others. Each one already enfolds all of the others in this perichoresis, meaning this dance that's ongoing. So that's like the Judeo-Christian, especially the Christian model, which someone like Raimon Panikar, who's also a Hindu and Buddhist, has tried to take forward in imagining the Trinity in non-dual sense. So for me, I've played on both sides of those, and I feel the beauty in both of those framings. But in the Enlightenment communities, I often encounter more the emphasis on the one that then emanates, rather than kind of allowing multiplicity into the ultimate. And I'm just wondering if you want to have share any thoughts or metaphysical indulgences along those lines.
My leaning would be to would be to, from a non-dual perspective, emphasize the non-difference between the oneness that's emanating and the multiplicity, that they're non-different,
Right.
but they're different. But their differentiation means everything. What the differentiation means is kind of a celebration of the creative potential of the absolute. So I would be leaning much more in that direction, because the problem with the monism, it tends to be often inadvertently reductionistic. It tends to devalue the glory and the magnificence of the complexity of manifest existence, which is, from my perspective, an evolutionary perspective, the glory of God become manifest. That's where we can see how extraordinary the absolute really is. So in the monistic approach, which usually comes from kind of all left over from amber positions or amber perspectives, there's an inherent reductionism and a devaluing of the significance of the creativity of the absolute. And that doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense to me, because when we observe the creativity of the absolute, that's when we see how amazing, how mind-bogglingly glorious the absolute actually is. So when I enter into meditative states, of course, I'm not interested in the complexity and the magnitude of the creative genius of the creator of the universe. I'm more interested in, I want to enter into a state of monastic absolute reductionism and the dissolution of all differentiation. When I get up from the meditative seat, I want to be able to fully embrace the complexity, the glory of the complexity of manifest existence. And I feel that the spiritual life lived in full is dancing between both of those polarities, because they're both equally true. But I think that as embodied, created and creating human beings, I think the implications of an evolutionary context for us, if we really look into them, they force us, would compel us to live the most creatively engaged lives we're capable of, because that's the nature of who we are at an absolute level. That's what it means to me. It's very funny, and I'm sure we got to go in a minute, but it was very funny. I was at a conference here in India some years ago, and I was having a dialogue with the Swami, and I was talking about, evolutionary enlightenment, and the Swami said, "Andrew, evolution is an illusion." I said, "Swamiji, evolution might be an illusion, but it took the universe 14 billion years to create the conditions to make it possible for us to have this discussion where we're agreeing that evolution is an illusion." And he laughed, but he wouldn't give up his position. But yeah, just to finish that thought, I think that that as we awaken to the evolutionary context, as we awaken to it more and more from in an egoless place in ourselves, there is an obligation. Am I living the fullest life I'm capable of? Am I giving all my gifts? Am I giving everything back? Or am I holding, or am I resisting? Am I holding on for no good reason? Am I allowing inertia and fear and doubt and nihilism to allow me to hold myself back from giving my soul to this journey fully and absolutely and completely and unconditionally? So awakening to the evolutionary context, I believe, should compel us to give everything to life, to liberating our creative potential, for the sake of the evolution of the interior of the cosmos. I think that's ultimately what it's all about. That's as far as I've gotten anyway.
I'm very curious about the agency of communion. So in thinking, you have options of thinking of things in first, second, or third person terms. And when an intersubjective non-duality emerges, to what degree do you personally think of it in second person terms, as if it is a kind of an entity that might have strategies or implications, right? It certainly wants It wants a moreness of some kind. I asked Daniela whether she thought the breakdowns and breakthroughs are often ambiguous, right? And it's possible that one of the things going on in your community was a restructuring of it by the very kinds of intersubjective intelligence that were being unleashed. And
I'm sure that's true.
You
Sure,
think
that's
about
true.
them in entity-like terms sometimes. What do you make of that? What is it trying to do? I don't know, just to what degree does it show up as if it's a something else?
Well, in the evolutionary context, it shows up big time. We used to call it the new being. So the new being, which I am and you are, and we are that new being, awakening to itself and realizing itself and cognizing itself. It is simultaneously me, and it's simultaneously you, and it is both of us and all of us at the same time. And it's definitely not a static entity that's just vibrating in the presence of the eternal present, but it's a new being on a journey of becoming. And so I don't know how to answer your question more accurately than that, but it vibrates with agency. But it's not the agency of Andrew or Layman or Bruce. It's a higher agency that includes us and transcends us at the same time. And of course the work, at least in our work, in my work, the work to be done is to work more and more to give rise to this new being and to cultivate it, to cultivate its presence, and then to begin to work with it and to see what's possible. I feel we're very much at the beginnings of this exploration, but my experience of this new being is that it's pregnant with agency. It's pregnant with agency, and it's definitely wants us all to move forward and wants to move forward itself. But what I realize it needs, this is my belief. I might be wrong about this. That it needs us to be able for that movement to happen. It can't happen without us. We're the gasoline that makes the train move. At least that's my understanding.
Yeah, I think there's something really important about one, the acknowledgement of that kind of vertical tension that may have a two-way, flow to it. And circling back to earlier discussion, also just to the valuation of becoming and time and evolved being, this incarnational kind of orientation, in a sense, if you want to put it in Christian terms. I remember in Nepal meeting with some teachers who were, in my view, very, very realized, very deep, wise beings. But when I and a friend of mine talked to them about the state of the world and the state of the environment and kind of all of that, all of the crises that are multiply pressing on us, they weren't really very interested in that. They saw infinity beyond that. They saw the passing of forms as not that significant and didn't really want to focus on the engagement at that level of the suffering in the world. And that was, I could see maybe from an egoic side that was disappointing to me, but I think also from, the side of an awakening cosmic conscience, of an evolutionary approach that values being and becoming, that's really important in our time, that we not move away from that. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate that emphasis in your work.
Well, I mean, obviously they were Buddhists.
Yes.
And Buddhists don't, they can't relate to evolution. It just doesn't go in there. They don't. I mean, especially Asian Buddhists, but even Western Buddhists have trouble with the whole concept of evolution, because they're so focused on getting off the wheel of becoming. That's the whole idea, is to get off the wheel. You know, the Buddha realized he was on a merry-go-round, or that was what his understanding was at the time. The time was cyclical, not linear. So he realized, I've been on this merry-go-round hundreds of thousands of times. If I want to be free, I got to get off the merry-go-round. So except for some, I guess, very progressive or integrally informed Buddhists, most Buddhists haven't caught up with that, with the evolutionary discovery that we've made, 160, 70 years ago. And it's shocking. I once gave a talk at the ashram of a very famous Indian Swami, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, and I gave a talk about being and becoming. And when I was talking about being, he was smiling beatifically. When I started talking about evolutionary becoming, God is also the becoming of the universe. He came out of his meditation, he was looking at me like this. And then he's a lovely man, he was very kind to me. But he gave me a book. He said, Andrew, this is what you're saying is not true. And he gave me a book about cyclical time that was from the Vedas. And he's an educated man. He said, this is the truth. Time was cyclical, not linear. And he was disturbed by this idea of evolution. So this is very much the old Dharma, the old teaching, and it's not helpful. It's not helpful. And as you're saying, Bruce, all the more so in a world in crisis, the likes of which is getting worse and worse. That kind of thinking is not helpful. It takes us in the wrong direction. Because we have to have the courage to, it's easy for me to say, but we have to have the courage to try and face into what the hell we're going to do and how we're going to save ourselves, and not just see it as one big illusion. I met, this is many years ago, about 25 years ago, I was meeting with a great Tibetan Rinpoche called, I can't remember his name, but Chaptrul Rinpoche was his name. He was considered to be a living Buddha, Chaptrul Rinpoche, and he was very beautiful and he was very kind with me. But we invited one of his chief disciples, who's a young guy who's in his early 30s, who spent years meditating in Himalayan caves. And so we were in my hotel room and we said to this fellow, we'd love to hear about your spiritual experiences. And he said, all display. Because of course he was so grounded in the Mahayana teaching about emptiness, that ultimate reality is pure emptiness and anything else is illusion. We said, we know that, but we just love to hear. You've done this amazing retreats in caves, snowed in caves. You must have had the most amazing spiritual adventures. We'd love to hear about it. All display. And there was this feeling with speaking to him that his position wasn't coming from liberated knowing. It was coming from a adopted, orthodox perspective. And I think that while Buddhism has some of the best mind dharma ever given to humanity, a lot of Buddhism is still very much stuck in a 3,000-year-old paradigm that needs to come into the future. And it's obviously not true for all Buddhists, and there's a lot of movement in that area, but there's a big problem. Hope I won't get crucified for saying that. I remember. Sorry.
In the chat you sent us to deviate. If you want to finish the thought, go ahead, because I'm
good.
Okay.
I'm good.
You used a number of quotes from our mutual friend Steve McIntosh. One of them stood out to me because I've spoken with Steve about this a lot. This notion that, when a level or stage of development starts to show its pathologies, that's when it needs to be transcended by a next level. Right? And we are looking at some kind of general evolutionary traffic jam or bottleneck. Things aren't moving forward as quickly as we need them in order to respond to the general planetary crisis. But there's different ways of looking at that, because when I read that quote from Steve, which I know fairly well, I thought of a man getting on a horse. And I thought, if you start trying to ride a horse before you're on it, it's going to look weird and cause a lot of trouble. So it may be that we're not quite on the horse, right? It may be that the signs of the pathology indicate that it's time to go beyond something. It may mean that the signs of the pathology indicate that that thing hasn't really been installed yet. And there's two different takes in the integral community. One is that the kind of thinking associated with green has not been able to lead because of inherent problems in the way it values things and the important developmental elements that it leaves out. The other argument, which comes from, I think, what they're calling themselves the integral left now, is that the modernist system still basically runs everything and has been sabotaging both the traditionalists and the postmodernists, which have never really gotten off the ground, that we haven't seen anything like healthy, stable postmodernism yet. We haven't really upgraded our system to a green level of socioeconomics. There's a whole bunch of green things individually and collectively that haven't actually been accomplished yet. So I wonder what your take is on those two different views of the green problem. One saying we've got too much of it, and the other saying we haven't actually done it yet.
Well, I forged the path of evolutionary enlightenment by doing a lot of battle against my perception of what were green pathologies. So I don't think that, I mean, to be honest about myself, I doubt I can give you an truly objective response to the question, because I think my position is slightly biased. I have felt in my own work, the extreme narcissism that comes online with post-modernity becomes very problematic when we want to transcend the ego. And the hyper-personalization in the spiritual context that's a result of that narcissism becomes very problematic when we want to transcend the ego. So I've had difficulty. I've had a lot of difficulties with that. And then there's the flattening out of all hierarchies, which is a green pathology. I've had a lot of trouble with that, and I fought a lot of battles against those tendencies. So I think that the answer to your question is both things are true, because if you go to we start speaking about Scandinavia and Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Holland. Postmodernity has been very successful in the right-hand quadrants, and some of these pathologies I was speaking about are also rampant up there also. So the fact that we can't say that postmodernity has never fully come online, but I mean, does our human world as a whole need a lot more green, egalitarian compassion and love? Oh, absolutely, more than we can say. But that doesn't mean the postmodern revolution hasn't fully come online and isn't very much alive in certain parts of the world. And of course, it has to grow a lot more. But a big problem with postmodern pluralism, and this is something I've spoken to Steve a lot about, is the anti-modernist perspective of postmodernity, which blames all the problems that we're suffering from on modernity and not appreciating the great gifts that modernity has brought to all of us. And without modernity, postmodernity would not be possible. So I see it as being very complex, and I think that probably 2/3 of the world that we're living in needs a lot more postmodern affection and justice and sympathy and kindness and compassion. But at the same time, for people who are more developed and farther along, postmodernity is holding a lot of us back culturally, and it's responsible for a lot of the political and economic problems we're facing, and a lot of the injustice. So it's very complicated, and yeah. And I think in the integral context, I think that because my focus is really within the context of my work, so it's more, my view is rather exclusive rather than inclusive. So I want to be careful. I don't want my statements to be set to sound too sweeping, because I'm speaking about the narrow confines of the world that I live in and that I work within. But I feel within the integral context, a problem, and we spoke about this earlier in the call. The problem is that when when someone has an awakening to integral cognition, there's this huge flowering of the mind. The mind flowers, and one suddenly sees reality from so many different vantage points that one never could have dreamed of. And it really it's a form of enlightenment. I mean, it is obviously a form of cognitive enlightenment. But inadvertently, I believe that this beautiful intellectual flowering of integral cognition inadvertently empowers the narcissistic egoic self-sense, because we become more powerful. And we realize that a lot of people who have this kind of experience realize, not for the wrong reasons, that they're seeing more of reality than most people are seeing. And then in many ways, they might be smarter. And unless one is very spiritually developed, it's hard for that not to be taken on board by the ego. So that paradoxically, I found that integral cognition, while it's so essential for our overall development and also for our spiritual development, it inadvertently empowers the very part of ourselves that we need to transcend if we're actually interested in awakening to enlightened awareness. And I think within the integral context, from my vantage point, it's actually a big problem. Because, I mean, I know some people in the meta-modernist community and in the integral community feel that Kant has given too much importance to enlightenment, to enlightened awareness, but I certainly don't think so, because I think I think one doesn't have a full appreciation of the significance of the integral perspective without the actual, without actually awakening to these miraculous states of consciousness. They're part and parcel of the whole thing. It's not magical thinking; it's waking up to reality in a way that changes everything. And I found it like a little shocking and strange with this overemphasis on hyper-rationality.
For me personally, I always have to come back to, my relationships and my subjective truths and transformation. That's the fallback position. I I have to end up there, but I really appreciate that the community is diversifying into people with different specializations. Like it's really nice that there are some people focused much more on the subjective and intersubjective dimensions, and I'm very happy that the meta-modernists are taking the lower right and material conditions and social systems with their hyper-rationality much more seriously. But we've got to get the right kind of conversation going between all of these elements so that they're complementary and mutually supportive, I think.
Amen, brother. Absolutely. Because if we can't solve our own differences with respectfully in a way that we're all benefiting from it, we ain't cutting the mustard yet.
Yeah, I think we're approaching our time. That's a wonderful point, I think, to begin wrapping us up. I wanted to know if there is anything else that you feel that you'd like to add on this topic of the future faces of spirit, of what's up for our time spiritually.
I think no. I feel very grateful and very happy with everything we've talked about. I feel the most important things that I have to share have been said. I mean, as I said a few minutes ago, I'm very much hoping that enlightenment will be reinstated as the glorious jewel that it actually is. It was my hope that more and more of us would reawaken to that perspective and be able to include it, put it at the top of the pile there. once again, and then we could find some way to have some shared agreement about that. I always like to say that spirit is higher for this reason, because the postmodern ego doesn't like to think anything is higher than me and oneself. If you say spirit is higher, I say, what do you mean? What do you mean? So that of course there's a problem. So we want to be able to make a distinction between power hierarchy, dominator hierarchies, and growth hierarchies, and then begin to really look into the significance of growth hierarchies and what it actually means about liberating our own spiritual potentials. I feel very strongly about that. But I feel there's a great resistance. There's a great resistance. Sorry, Layman, you were going to say?
I'll get to it in a second. What you just said there reminded me of an experience I had. Years ago, I was in a Buddhist Sangha. And one of the things you had to do when you came in to the meditation room was to bow to the Buddha. And it was just amazing how many people that this was really difficult for. And you have to say, that's you're bowing to the highest thing that you value. It's not someone else's value being pushed over you here. I guess I wanted to say this has been great. Very nice to be with you. I had some very interesting state shifts at different points in the conversation. And I want you to feel very welcome to come and be interviewed on the author series when the book is ready.
Thank you so much. You guys have been really wonderful to talk to. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much. And I would love to talk to you again.
Terrific.
You guys are so sensitive and so open. I feel very moved to spend time with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I also wanted to extend the welcome for the author series. And I actually was thinking, because I kept shifting into different states through the whole talk, I didn't know if I wanted to comment on that or not. But yeah, it's been an interesting ride, to say the least. So I've quite enjoyed our exchange. Thank you very much. And
Okay,
look forward to talking again.
Thank you. Much love to both of you.
Now I can shave this mustache off.
No, that's so cool you did that. Right on, brother. That's so cool. That's so sweet.
All right. Thank you. Take care.
Okay, much love, you guys. Thank you.
Okay.